The hungry and stealthy Major quietly arrived at the farm field. Swiftly plucking a green vegetable, he hid under a tree and began eating voraciously. At the same time, he vigilantly observed his surroundings. Crows cawed not far away, signaling that something bad might happen. Following the sound of sheep bleating, he looked over and spotted some people. Hastily raising his pistol, he realized they were just a few children. He lowered his guard, gesturing them to stay silent. However, as he turned to leave, one of the kids suddenly shouted, forcing him to flee. Several German soldiers, alerted by the commotion, immediately pursued him. Helplessly, he jumped into the reeds. Unfortunately, the enemies quickly caught up. After seeing them move away, he cautiously emerged. But to his misfortune, he was captured. In less than 4 months at the base, 32 out of 35 crew members had disappeared. Sub-Lieutenant stared at the luggage with no owner in front of him, and the entire barracks felt incredibly desolate. Shortly after, he was to represent the 100th Squadron at Oxford University for an Allied meeting. Meanwhile, the Major was on a train being escorted, accompanied by several captured Allied pilots. Upon disembarking, they witnessed the small town on both sides of the railway devastated by their bombings. Angry locals began shouting insults and hurling stones at them, leading to chaos and a violent clash between the two sides. Several Allied pilots were killed. But luckily for the Major, he ran out of bullets, avoiding a dire fate. Regaining consciousness, he found himself on a carriage where 2 Germans planned to bury them. Realizing the danger, the Major struggled to roll off the carriage, got up, and hastily escaped. Running desperately while constantly looking back, fearing the enemy might catch up, he was soon exhausted and captured again. Subsequently, a German lieutenant conducted a superficial interrogation. The next day, they were loaded onto another train. Witnessing Jewish people being sent to concentration camps amid agonizing screams, their bodies thrown onto the train, the Major's group was simultaneously dispatched to the concentration camp. Back at the base, a new bombing mission was underway. Meanwhile, the Major and his companions arrived at the concentration camp, where many captured Allied pilots were held. Surprisingly, he saw some of his comrades and their squadron commander among the prisoners. The cold winter arrived, marking the beginning of the harsh days for Allied pilots in the concentration camp. During World War II, there was a rule in the Allied air forces that if a downed pilot managed to escape from occupied Europe, they would no longer be required to carry out flight missions and could safely return home. This was the Sachsenhausen 3rd Air Force Camp in Germany, under the jurisdiction of the German Air Force, housing exclusively downed Allied pilots. Currently, the treatment by the Germans was relatively humane, but the freezing conditions made life unbearable. They survived on potatoes throughout the year, but the sanitary conditions were acceptable, and they had access to various facilities for reading and listening to music. The only hope for everyone was the possibility of good news from the front lines, hoping to return home as soon as possible. They hadn't received letters for a long time because the Red Cross found it challenging to deliver mail to the POW camp. The soup they drank during meals contained meat of uncertain origin. Some speculated it might be rabbit meat, as there were many wild rabbits running around beneath the barracks. Until the Red Cross packages arrived, they had to make do with this. News time arrived, but there was still no good news from the front lines. The Allies were either trapped or pushed back. Emergency assembly began, and everyone hurriedly collected their belongings before being herded outside. Subsequently, their barracks were searched, and an electronic board was found hidden in a corner of a table. Meanwhile, back at the base, the Allies were realizing that the counterattack in Europe was imminent. The first squadron of bombers would be involved, and their missions in Germany were increasing, along with casualties. New recruits were constantly being sent in, and almost everyone had lost an intimate comrade. They refrained from getting to know each other because most of them wouldn't survive long. However, there was also some consolation. Many believed that Quinn and Bailey, along with many other comrades, had sacrificed themselves in Regensburg. Unexpectedly, with the help of resistance forces in France and Belgium, they returned to Sopwith, bringing hope to everyone. The two were considered lucky because of the rule in their squadron. If a downed pilot escaped occupied Europe, they wouldn't have to fly missions anymore and could safely return home. In the prisoner camp, the lieutenant spoke to the major, mentioning that he had once made a makeshift radio in his childhood and wanted to try it here. He needed copper wire, a grinding stone, and safety pins. He asked if the major could help him get these items, and the major said he would do his best. Suddenly, the air raid siren sounded in the camp, and everyone was rushed into the barracks. The sounds of anti-aircraft guns firing filled the air, and they hoped it was Berlin being bombed. However, gunshots were heard outside as someone had shot and wounded Harry for running outside the barracks. The Germans claimed he shouldn't have left the barracks and then herded everyone back inside. Meanwhile, back at the base, their missions were increasing and becoming more dangerous. The tension was high, and the bombers that went to bomb Berlin had not returned. The entire base anxiously waited, uncertain of the magnitude of the losses in this mission. When they saw planes returning, the counting began, and only 16 out of 31 returned. 15 had been shot down, and most of the returnees were severely injured. Another plane returned, and the entire base became busy. The air was filled with the painful cries, and that day was referred to as Black Monday due to the significant casualties, including 150 from the 100th Bomb Group. Some cockpits were directly hit, and Mena and Kinsella died instantly, at least spared from prolonged suffering. Some planes lost control and headed towards the formation. Harrison had to take evasive action to avoid a collision. Eventually, the plane plummeted, marking their 25th mission. Not only that, but the Germans attacked them again, killing parachuting crew members one by one. The crew members were getting younger, casualties were increasing, and the morale of the entire base plummeted. They needed a distraction from the harsh reality of war. In the POW camp, the major managed to obtain the grinding stone by exchanging cigarettes. He then disassembled parts from the gramophone and cut copper wire from the lamp. Finally, the long-awaited letters arrived, and the lieutenant's girlfriend wrote, promising to marry him and expressing the hope that the major could be his best man at the wedding. Back at the base, another mission came up, another bombing run on Berlin, with the same route as the previous day. Soon, the lieutenant's makeshift radio was ready, but it failed to pick up any signals. The major suggested waiting for better weather conditions and considering escape. Seeking the lieutenant's opinion, the major discovered the lieutenant believed the chances of escaping alive were too slim, especially without a well-thought-out plan. At the base, the colonel announced the 100th Bomb Group's bombing mission to Berlin for the day, targeting the Daimler-Benz ball-bearing factory, following the same route as Black Monday. The 100th Bomb Group had only 15 flyable planes left, the same number as 2 days ago when they were shot down by the Germans. This marked Rossi and his crew's 25th mission, and the odds of their safe return were not high. Prayers were uttered, hoping for their safe return. The probability of overcoming the German Luftwaffe increased with the addition of the P-51 Mustang fighter planes, currently the most formidable aircraft on the battlefield. With P-51 Mustangs providing full escort during the mission, the tide of the air battle began to turn in favor of the Allies. As they approached Berlin, a large number of aircraft approached, causing confusion about friend or foe. Quickly realizing they were German planes attacking the 45th Squadron, P-51 Mustangs swiftly intervened. The bull turret gunner signaled the pilot after seeing Colonel Bennett's aircraft, firing a green signal flare. The navigator informed the pilot that they were over Berlin but seemed to have missed the initial point. The entire bomber formation then adjusted towards the target. The bombardier called the pilot, spotting German planes at 11 o'clock. P-51 Mustangs rapidly engaged in combat, creating a path for the bombers. An intense aerial battle ensued. The pilot called the bombardier, indicating the imminent bombing. Bombs rained down, turning the ground into an inferno. Surprisingly, the 100th Bomb Group only lost one plane, with 14 returning safely. Rossi and his crew also made it back safely, completing their 25th mission and signaling their eligibility to go home. Joy and relief filled everyone at the base. The entire base erupted in cheers, celebrating the success of the mission. However, the joy was short-lived as Jack delivered unwelcome news. The service standard was raised from 15 to 30 missions, applicable to new crews arriving after next week. Those already in service had to complete 28 missions during this period.
At least you'll make it out of this fucking war. I mean, changing the rules on us mid-game? That's bullshit, Jack.
Jack revealed that higher-ups hoped they all would perish in the skies, and no one would care. In the POW camp, the corporal identified the issue with the radio, likely due to residue such as glue or mud affecting conductivity. After a moment, they finally received a signal and tuned into the BBC broadcast. Quickly grabbing a pen, they recorded frontline information. During subsequent bombing missions over Berlin, the 100th Bomb Group suffered heavy losses. They realized that solely bombing targets was insufficient. They needed to destroy the German Air Force. Rossi understood this, having completed 25 missions and fulfilled his duty. Now, he could go home. A few days later, the POW camp experienced another urgent air raid alert. A group of Germans was dispatched as Allied comrades revealed that the British spent a year digging 3 tunnels in the northern part of the camp, reaching a depth of 9 meters. The German seismographs couldn't detect them, and more than 80 people had already escaped. The Germans were now aware of the scale of the breakout. The major told the lieutenant that they should escape while the Germans were occupied with chasing the British. However, the lieutenant emphasized the need for caution. At that moment, they were informed that the German Schönleit wanted the 2 of them to report to the office immediately. The German major revealed that due to the British escape incident, Commander Lindemann had been relieved of duty. Most of the escapees were recaptured, and regrettably, 50 of those recaptured had been executed. He warned everyone against any retaliatory actions and strongly discouraged any further escape attempts. Now, he had orders to designate all Jewish prisoners in Stalag Luft III. Allied comrades insisted that Stalag Luft III housed only Americans. The German major continued, stating that Berlin was considering transferring control of all POW camps in Germany from the German Air Force to the SS and Gestapo. If this happened, it would be disastrous for everyone. His words served as both a warning and a threat, making the 2 men realize how bleak their chances of going home had become. Rossi expressed his concerns to the colonel, explaining that leaving would increase the workload for Schanz and Hermich. He couldn't fathom the idea of a new recruit taking his place and sacrificing themselves on their first mission, perpetuating a cycle of replacements. He didn't want that to happen, so he decided not to go home and would wait until the war ended. The colonel mentioned that General Doolittle had ordered a complete change in air combat strategy. The counteroffensive would only occur after the complete destruction of the German Air Force, achieving full air superiority. The new strategy involved using bombers as bait, outlining the upcoming missions for the bomber squadrons. Despite this, Rossi chose to stay and became the new commander of the 350th Squadron.